Hello and welcome. I'm super pleased today to be joined by Michael Halaas, the Deputy CIO from Stanford Healthcare and School of Medicine. Michael and I have spoken a number of times over the past few years, and we recently caught up on the topic of work unleashed and how Stanford, who's always been known globally for their transformative and innovative approach to biomedical research and education, and are now on the front lines fighting COVID head on with over 300 active projects aimed at fighting COVID. So before we start, as a little bit of a backdrop, we're now living through an era of unprecedented change. And I just don't think there's going to be a single day where it's going to be, okay, COVID is done. This situation has impacted every enterprise across every industry. We've all had to move quickly to adjusting to working remote, which now seems like such a legacy conversation. We've all learned so much over the past few months and all agree, I think, that we will come out of this stronger and better than before. Now that we've transitioned to working remote, the conversations have shifted to what does the future new normal look like? And what does the business as unusual look like? I personally have had literally hundreds of technology leader conversations over the past few months, and a few common themes have emerged. COVID-19 has certainly accelerated the digital agenda across all, if not most industries today. Major projects are being paused or canceled. The remote workforce is here to stay, and post-COVID, we're going to have a workforce that will be more virtual, collaborative, and tech savvy than it was previously, and I might add more discerning as well. Cloud migration efforts are on hyperdrive. Companies were either on digital platforms or now on burning platforms that need to move. Cloud is the only way forward to be agile, to be resilient, and to be able to connect employees, customers, and partners around the world. And every business process is now a target for automation. So with that, Michael, welcome. First of all, many thanks for all the great work that you and Stanford are doing. And it's very much appreciated. Maybe we can start with a little bit of your background. What has your career been like? How did you end up being the Deputy CIO at Stanford? And what is the scope of your role right now? And maybe what might surprise people to know about Stanford?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Nice to see you again, Paul. So I have two roles here at Stanford. One is, as you said, in the IT space, which is Deputy CIO. And about a year ago, we fused our IT organizations between the Stanford School of Medicine and Stanford Healthcare for strategic reasons that I could describe. So I'm now deputy over that. But then I'm also part of the strategy office for Stanford Medicine. And in that capacity, I'm associate dean for industry relations and digital health. So I work a lot on our digital health initiatives and strategic alliances with industry. And it's across many industries, but as you can imagine, being here in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of big tech and life sciences companies and the like, which leads to all kinds of interesting innovation. So it's actually a really nice place to be able to bridge this highly innovative driven industry relations role into the operational and deployment role that I have in IT. So our ability to bring innovations in rapidly and get them into practice that's my job, which is what an amazing time to do that in healthcare now at a place like this in Silicon Valley. It's pretty amazing, really. So I don't know how I got here, but so my career, I've always been oriented toward health and also computer science. That's what I studied those. Early on in my career, I was actually pursuing a career in research. I was doing neuroanatomy and neuropharmacology research. And through that process, realized that the research process hands-on wasn't really for me. So I gravitated back toward technology, which has always fascinated me, just from the fundamentals of it, but more toward the application of it and how transformative it can be. And it started really in the early days of the web, when the web was ugly and couldn't do very much, to where we are now, which is pretty incredible. And I may be a little bit of an oddity, but I've been at Stanford my whole career, which is very strange for a technology professional. I've almost left multiple times. I've certainly thought about it because I know it's strange to be in one place for this long. But the wonderful thing about Stanford is it's endlessly challenging. And it's fantastic to see the work that you do be a part of something that is mission driven, that goes out and has impact on people's lives. And just watching that happen and being surrounded by the caliber of people that are here has been an amazing experience. So I feel like I still have learned and grown tremendously. So I've been here pretty much this whole time. And, in the last year, as I said, when we brought our IT organizations together, this ability to bridge, the education mission early stage fundamental discovery-based research all the way into healthcare operations and applications now is really tremendous. So that's sort of my arc.
Yeah, well, it's quite fascinating. You know, I've worked for been very blessed to work for some great companies in my career as well. And I worked for Sun Microsystems, which, for those that don't know, actually Sun stands for Stanford University Network. You know, the founders came out of Stanford there. And I just imagine that when you're surrounded by all this sort of brilliance that's going on, and you know the level of sort of knowledge that you're surrounded by, I sometimes feel it's like when you're surrounded by engineers, there's no shortage of advice on how you can do your job better. So I'm sure over the years you've had to deal with a little bit of that as well. So shifting a little bit to sort of maybe reflecting a little bit on the past, you know, I think technology leadership, technology professionals, we've all had to reinvent ourselves many times over to stay relevant. And to your point about staying in the same role, I'm sure that there are technologies and things that you've been working on over the years that probably don't even exist today. You know, I was a COBOL programmer, you know, back in the 80s. You know, we all figure out how to reinvent ourselves and work with you know, more improved technology. What's the technology strategy been in maybe some of the guiding principles that you've put in place at Stanford there?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's hard to say that we have one strategy, honestly, because you know, the idea of multi-speed IT is something that we very much embrace, and the requirements of the missions that we have tend to be very different. You know, on the healthcare side, obviously has to be incredibly high rigor, fault tolerant, redundant, secure, because at the end of whatever technology it is, people's lives are literally at stake, the health, you know, their welfare, their families. So that requires a certain kind of mindset and rigor and process and formality and thoughtfulness and care that has to be, you know, very intentional. It tends to be more slow moving. On the polar opposite side of that is our research domain. And at a place like this, and I know many of your customers are in research domain too, where flexibility and agility is absolutely paramount. You know, we have a body of people here who, you know, they're hired intentionally, you know, our faculty, to think out of the box and do things new. And many of them are incredibly technology savvy themselves. I mean, to your point, you know, I was here when it was google.stanford.edu and yahoo.stanford.edu. And
Yep.
you know, we have faculty who are literally inventing new programming languages and methods. So we have to be very adaptable on the research technology side, but also rigorous. I mean, there are infrastructure components that have to really be there, but we have to go in with a partnership mindset. So our strategy is listen to our faculty and our community very carefully and get to yes, almost no matter what it takes. And you know, in some ways we sacrifice the kind of formality that we would see on the healthcare delivery side to really get those research projects off the ground so that they can move forward.
Yeah.
And then on the education front, of course, you know, that's really all about user experience and what is, in particular with medical education, because it's a very high touch, high modality kind of experience to learn medicine. So we want to make sure that the user experience of that education, both on the teacher and the learner side, is paramount. So again, I'm not getting to an IT strategy exactly, a much more kind of a high level approach that we try to balance. You know, as we put our portfolio together, we have to think about all of these things and how do we make the trade-offs that are necessary to make sure that we're being successful in all of them.
Yeah, the partnership model is absolutely key. You know, it's funny when you said, you know, the path to yes. It's extremely hard. You know, I've had this philosophy myself over many years to sort of what's the path to yes. When it gets really hard, I default to yes, we're not going to do it, just because it's a bit of a cheat. But yeah, you know, that can be hard. But I think the most creative and active creative dialogue comes from that. We've been partners for a number of years, you know, Box and Stanford, and you've been a great contributor to our advisory boards, and your feedback has been you know, really, really great. Maybe you could share a little bit about your relationship with Box. You know, what's it been like working with us, and you know, since we started working together. I don't know how many years now, but I know it's it's a good number of years.
It's a good number. I actually have lost count too, but it's been many. So, and I've actually been there since day one. One of the benefits of being in one place.
Yeah.
So, I would say that, maybe I'll start on a personal note. I really enjoy working with Box. I found, like, to our conversation about the partnership model, I found Box to be a partner all the way through. Sometimes you get into relationships that feel like vendor customer. And I think from the very beginning, Box has really been there with us. And, our introduction to the relationship with Box, candidly, was in response to security incidents. And this was many years ago, where we're having breaches of on-prem infrastructure. And we had to quickly find a way to share protected health information in a way that was secure, that we could do at scale across our enterprise. And that's where Box really stepped in for us. And at the time, this was long enough ago that not many cloud companies were really in the business of hosting healthcare data and understanding all that went along with that, including corporate liability and all the regulatory aspects. So, Box really worked with us in the early days to figure out how can we do this. And it meant actually engineering new security controls. This is way before you had things like Shield. This was quite a while ago. So that sort of set the tone for the relationship in terms of us working together to find solutions. And that's really continued to this day. So I think that's been great.
I'm a big proponent in asking our customers to make us work, to push us harder, to make us better, because therefore everybody, we have close to 100,000 customers now. And how can we help other customers that, have highly regulatory environments, high levels of risk posture, and so on, and how can we help them, to serve their customers? Something I touched on earlier, and I'm very interested to maybe get a little bit more insight from you on this, is that Stanford is at the forefront of fighting COVID right now. And you mentioned to me when we caught up just recently that you had over 300 active COVID-related projects. Is there anything you could share a little bit about sort of that effort and what's going on over there? And I'm sure you must have a lot of people that have codependency on labs and things like that, and the whole shift to remote work and how you sort of handled that and what you've learned during this, these past few months.
Being in a place like Stanford, and I will include the university and Stanford Medicine in this because we're interconnected greatly. So, we had our immediate response, as did everybody. And that was multi-pronged. Here we had this campus full of people, including lots of students from overseas and other places. And suddenly it's shelter in place. And so one of the things we had to do very quickly was empty out the campus, which is not simple. We have 20, 30,000 people here who we need to get on airplanes and move around. We had to move our staff to working from home where they could, at least on some parts of our enterprise. And then we had the healthcare response, which, actually the response from the health system started before shelter in place, before March. It started when we started hearing about this early in China and then Italy. Our lab started getting to work on developing tests for the coronavirus. In fact, we had one of the first FDA-approved tests for corona in the country and started very rapidly doing testing. But then at shelter in place, we had to prepare our health system for the surge, which we were seeing happening in other places, and it was very dramatic. And in the early days here in Santa Clara County, we were a hotspot. It looked like we were on the trajectory to have a major catastrophe. Now, thankfully, that didn't happen. There's a lot more to say about the health system, so I'll come back to that. But since you mentioned the 300 projects, so the other thing that happened is our research programs here absolutely roared to life around COVID. We had to empty out campus, which meant, largely shutting down the research mission, which at a place like Stanford, which is a major research institute, shutting down a research mission is quite dramatic. But then we repurposed a lot of our research personnel and labs and so on toward COVID. And we do now have over 300 research projects focused on solving the pandemic. And it's really across, many domain areas. So one of the things that I mentioned already was this proactive development of diagnostics. So we developed what's called an RT-PCR test, which is the test for the virus itself. We also developed a serology test, which hopefully will help to detect immunity. That's also one of the most accurate serology tests that are out there. And then we're working still on things like home testing kits and even saliva-based testing kits, because the more that people can self-test, do it at home and get rapid results, that's incredibly important for the testing capacity, which we all know is problematic. So that's one whole thread of projects, and there are many of those. So in addition to that, there's the basic fundamental virology. So understanding the structure of the biology, how it behaves, things like multi-omic study, where you're looking at the RNA structure of the virus and the omics of the human host and comparing those to see if there's, there are adaptations that are happening and how the host and the virus interact. Lots of that. Lots of work on vaccine development. So we're involved in many of the vaccine trials that are underway very actively. And then lots of active clinical trials as well for other kinds of therapeutics, whether it's like hydroxychloroquine, which we've all heard about, other kinds of drugs, even non-drug therapies, lots of clinical trials that are happening. And then even beyond the kind of direct treatment, direct virus research studies, there are threads around epidemiology in a broad sense. We have wonderful epidemiologists here who are looking at the overall flow and behavior of the pandemic itself to understand it, not only here in the United States, but globally. And then finally, being here at Stanford, informatics and data science is one of our big strengths. So there's been amazing amounts of data scientists working on this problem, modeling the pandemic, doing predictive models, also modeling out and developing tools that help health systems understand their own capacity, whether that's capacity for hospital beds, ICUs, ventilators, other kinds of equipment, and then providing those models out, not only for us to use here locally, but also out to the governor's office here in California, local governments, federal governments, and others. So it's a pretty amazing array of projects, yes. Many of which have pretty intense technology needs. Back to the thread of multi-speed before, we've been sprinting, to say the least, to try to make sure all of these get off the ground and are successful.
Yeah, it's amazing to see just how many as organizations shifted sort of almost overnight to working remote, just the ability and the creativity with which to get back to being productive, and in some cases even more productive than we were pre. Certainly, as I noted earlier, we're learning a lot, and generally we all believe we're going to come out of this stronger than we were before. What have you learned in the last few months? You think about that's made you think differently. We were doing things previously in a certain way, and we've been following certain ways of doing things we've been doing for many, many, many years. And sometimes it takes something like a big disruption like this for us to think differently and realize there are actually some better ways to do things. Now, there are some things that, of course, are not as good. But in the most part, I'm hearing from a lot of organizations, a lot of people that there are a lot of things that are better. And so it's sort of, what have you learned? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about sort of how we're thinking about what the future might look like in this regard as well. I was telling someone earlier, I just recently read a book that was called Remote, No Office Required. And it was written back in 2015, and ironically, it talks a lot about the benefits and the increased productivity and so on that people get in working in a sort of remote work environment. At the same time, this notion of base camp, which is sort of the office or the campus that you go to, and where you need high fidelity interaction and things like that, and finding that right blend between the two. And I think we're all going through a series of firsts and learning a lot. But maybe you could share a little bit about what you've learned in the last few months in that regard.
Yeah, well, many things, many things for sure.
Share a few things.
I think, first of all, we are more adaptable than we might think we are, both as people and as organizations. Thinking about, our strategy here, we have an IT strategy, and, among the things that we wanted to really start to address is telehealth. And we easily did 2 years of our strategic plan in 3 weeks. And not only from a technology standpoint, but from an organizational standpoint, we have physicians now adopting and embracing telehealth in ways that they didn't think that they would or could, or maybe even had been resistant to in some places. So that's been really impressive, that when we really put our minds to something, we can adapt. And we can adapt very rapidly, and that's true across many disciplines. And remote work, in some ways, was the smoothest and easiest transition for us. Oddly, because sort of staff work that seemed to go very well, as I know it has for many. Now, of course, as you mentioned, it's a journey, and I think we're starting to see some fatigue with that set in.
Yeah.
There's pandemic fatigue in general, but there's also like a same four walls fatigue. That I think we have to figure out a little bit. The tools work, and we can get the work done, but it's starting to not feel the same as what I'm hearing from our team.
Yeah, it's something that, to your point around the shifting and the changing of work patterns and behaviors. Something we saw early on at Box is we don't see content, of course, but we see the movement and the sharing and the collaboration and the activities that are going on. And you can map out from that what's actually happening during the working day. And we generally have found that the work day is flattened. People are starting to work earlier in the day, maybe working later in the day. It's sort of the always on mentality. We're seeing maybe a little bit of a softening, sort of in and around sort of lunch periods, but we're also seeing at the same time more forgiveness in sort of the way people are working, in terms of we're not bound by the 9 till 5. We're not bound by the drudgery of commutes, to and from the offices, and there's more flexibility that's emerging in the working day. I think it's okay if somebody has at 3 p.m. walking the dog on their calendar, or 11 a.m. going to the grocery store, because we know that the working day is no longer sort of time bound the way it was maybe previously. And I think there's a lot of benefits in the flexibility of the working day, but at the same time, people have to recognize that you do have to be able to turn off, or from and sort of decompress. It's very, very easy to switch from meeting to meeting to meeting. I've started to now, for every meeting that would have been 30 minutes, default to 25 minutes, and every meeting that was an hour, default to 50 minutes. And what I'm finding is that meetings still start on time, they end on time. We're not disenfranchising the purpose of the meeting by ending 5 minutes off, being 25 minutes or 50 minutes. So that's good. And at the same time, it builds in that little bit of sort of decompression time in between meetings that you probably would, if you're in the office environment, we find ourselves switching from maybe room to room or floor to floor, and most meetings start 5 minutes late anyway, or whatever it might be because of that, right? So I think we're sort of learning these new ways. But I did want to touch on one point, and that was the sort of the culture side of things. We've always had, or I've always had, a close relationship with our chief people officer, head of culture, prior to COVID, and now we're more significantly joined at the hip than we ever were before. But it's not just a case, as you said, it's not just a case of technology. I think technology is an enabler to an outcome, or an enabler to allow people to, communicate effectively in remote circumstances. But it's really about culture now. Some companies are nervous. They weren't, or they didn't grow up in what you would consider a work from anywhere culture. You can speed some things up, but you can't always speed up, the things around sort of change management and so on, at least at a comfortable pace. And I know there's a lot of accelerated change going on. Any insights into how Stanford is managing sort of this sort of the cultural aspects? And this is not technology related, this is just leadership related. How do you help navigate an organization through this type of change?
Well, it's a great question, and we're very much figuring that out. But as you say, I've certainly experienced this, and what I'm hearing from my teams is they feel in some ways more connected than ever to their team because they're interacting constantly. Everybody's always on chat. There are huddles. There's an intention and a focus to the team. What I am hearing though is that outside of the team, they feel much less connected. Because again, every interaction has to be by intention. So you can't intentionally run into somebody by accident, or get a sidebar on the sidewalk, or whatever, the things that usually sort of fuel that kind of community-based energy. Those we're having a harder time with, because traditionally, especially at a place like Stanford, we've been very on campus and in the office focused, just culturally. So we are working on that within our organization, which is about 800 people. We're going through what we're calling an organization 2.0 exercise. So we're trying to think through. So we know where we are now. We know that, some of our people have to be on site because we're supporting the physical healthcare system and the operating rooms and so on. So we have some of our team that has to be on site all the time, but still many of us are remote. So we're trying to think through. So we know where we are now. We know that this is at least through January. We don't know what happens then or how long it's going to extend. So let's take this in stages and think through all of the various aspects, including culture. How are we going to collaborate? What's the right approach to being on site? How do we respect the parts of our team that have to be on site and balance that with the people who don't, so it doesn't feel like there's inequity? So we're still thinking through all of that and deeply involving our staff. So we have, I think, 9 or 10 various work streams, and we're involving staff in that. And of course, that's happening not just within our organization, but much broadly at a higher level, both in the health system and on the university side. So we're trying to figure that out. And, just one other thing on the culture, that in the health system, from day one, our health workers, they leaned into this. They ran toward the pandemic, not away from it. They're on site every day, literally putting their lives at risk. So that affects our culture in a pretty deep way too. So, parts of us can be remote, but again, many of us can't be. So it's interesting to see how that plays out as well.
Yeah, it's sort of, what does the new normal look like? Business as unusual look like as we look forward? There's no blueprint or rear view mirror data that we can look at that says, well, this is what we did before, and this is what we learned. And I think you're right. Businesses and business offices, campuses are really designed to bring people together in relatively close proximity in order to collaborate in sort of high fidelity interactions and so on. And I think that they're a poor fit for social distancing, right? And so, what does the future office look like? And for me, it's going to be that balance. It's that hybrid balance between maintaining some of the benefits that we've learned from the remote work, and then balancing that with some of the value of bringing people together. I think it's also why we see a lot of people, or a lot of organizations, taking a little bit more of a wait and see approach. They're sort of pushing out further the sort of re-entry date. And quite frankly, I think that we haven't seen the last of this in any shape or form. And if we see waves, we don't want to be creating whiplash for our organization, going back to an office space and then resorting back to 100% remote again. And I think on top of that, the complexity of moving back is extremely high, right? Outside of just employees being more discerning, and it's how do they get to the offices and public transportation and all those things. There's a patchwork quilt of government guidelines and state and city, and it changes on a regular basis. So it's very complex.
And I think, one of the key things that we're all wrestling with is, how do you maintain equity of interaction? Yes. When we're all 100% remote, that actually works pretty well. When it's partial, not so much. And, in our education domain, as I'm sure many of you are seeing with your kids, that's also a challenge, because, education also is meant to be interactive. So in our case, as we bring students back, we, rather than have this inequitable experience, because we can only get so many people in a classroom space, not everybody, we're doing it all online so that it is equitable. Now, they'll be on campus, so they'll engage in other ways, but for the education part specifically, it will all be virtual. So that's just sort of an interesting case study, and how that then plays out in the work environment will be really interesting to see as well. Well,
in some ways it's playing out in a similar fashion, in that I think everybody being on sort of the same sort of communication platform, so to speak, is an equalizer. And we are seeing, I know we see this at Box, and I know other organizations have seen this as well, a greater participation and a greater engagement generally across the board now everybody's working from the versus, half the people are dialing in, some are on video, some are in the conference room. That actually is more disruptive to the benefit of a meeting than the way we're operating right now, which is quite interesting. So how do we preserve that in the future as well, right? It's quite interesting. We always talk a lot about digital natives and digital transients and generations of workforce. And, we are going to have a post-COVID workforce. We have pre-COVID, which is all of us, and we will have new employees in the future that have never been in the workplace before. So they won't know what pre-COVID is like. They'll only know what post-COVID is like. And, that'll be an interesting sort of study, I think, to see there. Switching gears a little bit, you mentioned earlier about the sort of the regulatory environment that you work within. And certainly, as you know, this is something that Box focuses heavily on. And in fact, as we talk about this new sort of work unleashed, and as we've been working on secure remote work as well, the attack surface has changed significantly since everybody moved to working remote. Responding to a crisis does not mean security threats are any less pervasive than they were previously. And in fact, we've seen an uptick, and I know most others have as well, in COVID-19 malware attacks, phishing attacks, bogus news articles, malicious emails. We've seen a significant amount of additional blocking that we've had to do for that. Anything you're doing different or need to do anything different in this regard as far as security and risk is concerned in this new environment?
Well, I mean, we're such a regulated environment that we've been, I think we've always taken a very aggressive approach to protecting our assets, whether they're remote or not, because our workforce moves around, and even though we're more remote now, for many years we've had physicians doing healthcare from home and so on. So I think we have pretty good strategies there. But obviously, when it comes to protecting content in the cloud, things get more complicated to a degree, and we're definitely seeing an uptick. Everything from ransomware to people trying to get in and get IP, specifically around COVID. So I think the future of this is going to be in better monitoring and threat detection. I think that's sort of an ever-moving target. So I don't know that we're doing anything different in the immediate term. But I think at long term, we will have to consider how to do things a little bit different. And in particular, I think one of the challenges that we have, as do many, we have this very complex, you might say, fractured environment where we have activities happening in many, many places, both on cloud platforms and SaaS solutions and on-prem, and now, with remote workforce. And so actually having an overall understanding of what's really happening is still very much a challenge. So I think that's something where we're going to have to continue to evolve our strategies for sure.
Yes.
And then also, the regulatory landscape keeps shifting as well. It was a little bit loosened up in some areas, important areas for COVID, like in terms of how much we can share data and how many hoops we have to go through and how long that takes. But in general, there are so many regulations coming from so many different bodies that just even understanding how they work together is really a challenge. And for us, there's a certain set of regulatory issues on the healthcare delivery side. And then when you get into research, and especially human subject research, there are additional ones. So that's a pretty complex area. And it's, one of the things about Box that I think is great is that you have a clearly a very deep understanding of what these are, and you're building tools to help us manage that, which is very much critical.
Yeah, we're having more and more. I've been having more and more what I would call architecture-led conversations as well around how do we make sure we build out an architecture that allows that sort of frictionless user experiences, some freedom of choice, but at the same time help to protect and manage and govern the most sensitive information. And in fact, as we listen to our customers and we see what's going on in these new environments, you mentioned earlier around sort of telemedicine, we've seen significant increases in the usage of our platform from government and healthcare and telemedicine, as only you can imagine. And we've also pulled forward and accelerated things that were on our roadmap. Key product updates around malware detection, automated classifications, improved search and performance, numerous UX upgrades, device management improvements. All these things have been, are all to support the new secure remote work paradigm that we're operating in. Anything in the emerging technology space, new tech that you'd like to see, or are you, part of what I do is seek feedback, and I think, to me, feedback is a gift, and just like you shared here. But anything sort of on the horizon for you is what you'd like to see from new tech? I'm starting to see lots and lots of more QR codes, touchless. I'm starting to see that shift in the consumer space. I'm starting to see it in the enterprise space, physical space. A lot less touch and a lot less physical interaction, tends to be more QR code and touchless. Anything you're seeing there or would like to see?
I mean, where to start? I think, one area that I think is still very much in the emerging days, but has a lot of promise is ambient AI and how that gets applied. And when we think about that in healthcare, there are all kinds of applications of ambient AI. So just to explain what I mean by that. So for example, automatically capturing and transcribing the interactions between a physician and a patient, for example, or monitoring people at home in ways that turns healthcare from being an episodic interaction with your physician to 24/7 care. Things like computer vision that's AI assisted that can detect if a person falls, or if other kinds of activities that matter toward their healthcare. I mean, through the healthcare lens, I think that's something that we're quite excited about and want to see emerge further. And particularly the home healthcare monitoring is a very exciting area. As we think about how do you extend telehealth and make it more effective, if you're talking about virtual care delivery overall, we need to be able to do more than just converse by video. There's a lot more that goes into health than that, and there's tons of stuff happening there. And then selfishly, I think on the research side, just the ability to manage very large data sets better than we can now. I mean, it's one thing to be able to store them, which we can do, but to be able to operate on them, of course, the cloud offers tremendous compute, but it's pretty easy to overwhelm even what the capacity that's out there now when you get into healthcare data, because it gets very big very quickly. So, I mean, there are many others, but those are two that come to mind.
Yeah, and I think that's also another accelerated, I won't call it trend because I think it's been in place for a while, but it's accelerating now, and that is the investments in the machine learning to learn from these very large data sets that very, very hard for human beings to absorb that amount of information and deduce signals and actionable insights. We're seeing, outside of machine learning, digital labor, automation, more and more focus, accelerated focus in those areas. And that's where we're starting to see, as I mentioned earlier, a shift in budgets are focused on these areas. Now we're finding that the cost of not making investments in these areas, not making these investments in resilient services that allow organizations to work any place, anytime, anywhere, the impact actually is unfortunately turning out to be greater than the cost of what the investments would have been. And so this is where sort of the survival comes in, business survival comes in. If you're going to survive post-COVID, you really need to be making those investments. And if there's one positive sign, it is the acceleration of maybe catching up on some technology investments that needed to have been made for a while. As we wrap up, Michael, any sort of last words of advice or feedback that you want to share?
Well, I think mainly just, in reflecting on the last 6 months and what an amazing experience it's been, I just would express my gratitude, particularly to healthcare workers, having seen these people really literally on the front lines. As I said before, they ran toward this pandemic. And I know for a fact, people I know, they, especially in the early days, they're interacting with the COVID positive patients and trying to figure out how to do that and adapt to the scenario. And they were very much committed, but also, frankly, a little bit afraid because nobody understood. We still don't, but even then, less. So it's really tremendous, not only at Stanford, but healthcare workers really around the globe, really out there on the front lines for us, and all the other first responders too. and in addition, of course, all of our IT teams, which have been challenged in ways I think we never thought we would be in our careers. So it's really inspiring to be a part of.
Yeah, really appreciative of all the great work and what everybody's doing over there, putting their health on the line to help others. It's just a incredible humanitarian side of things, and that's actually it's a big thing that I think all organizations that are going to be successful in the future. This is where leading with empathy is the number one priority. Making sure your employees are the well-being are well and healthy, their families are taken care of, and the work will take care of itself. So I think all organizations, if nothing else, should be leading with empathy as their number one priority here. I'm a big believer in the wisdom of our community and our technology community, and with that, I'd really like to thank Michael for sharing your perspectives, your valuable insights, and for the great work that Stanford's doing. I know, especially at times like this, it's really appreciative. Hopefully, you'll also find some nuggets of value in this conversation for those that are listening in today. So I'd like to say thanks again to Michael, and thanks for joining everybody, and be safe.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you.